If you're watching this video, you probably know that Resident Evil 4 is widely regarded as being a very good game. I first played it on the GameCube back when it came out in 2005, and then again in 2007 on the Wii, and most recently in early 2021 on the PC. While going through this most recent run on the game, I couldn't believe that a title that came out 16 years ago could feel this fresh and balanced. The game is just fun. The pacing is great, the variety of environments, the shooting, the merchant.
Over here, stranger.
This game has a lot working for it, and I'm not alone in thinking that it's a classic. I know that the controls are a point of controversy for a lot of people, but personally I like the controls, and I feel like the game is paced and suited for that control style. And while it does take a little bit of getting used to, I don't think it gets in the way of enjoying the game once you really get going. The game was directed by Shinji Mikami, the same person who directed the first Resident Evil game back in 1996. In addition to the Resident Evil games leading up to the fourth entry, Mikami had a prominent role in a lot of other great games, including, but not limited to, Disney's Aladdin on the Super Nintendo, the Dino Crisis series, Beautiful Joe, Killer 7, and The Evil Within. Released in 2014, The Evil Within is the last game to be directed by Mikami. Prior to its release, Mikami expressed that the survival horror genre had become too action-oriented, and that he wanted to create a true survival horror game. Technically speaking, Resident Evil was not the first survival horror game, but it's definitely the game that helped to popularize the genre, and Capcom is credited with coining the term survival horror. Resident Evil 4 is the game that sparked a distinct shift toward a more action-oriented gameplay in the series, a trend that would continue on to Resident Evil 5 and 6, to the point where one could argue that those last two titles are really just action games with some horror elements added in. According to Mikami, Resident Evil 4 focused more on action due to the poor sales of the Resident Evil Remake at the time. Mikami and some others involved felt that it would be wise to shift the direction of the series in order to stay relevant with players. It's interesting to me that in the 90s, Mikami helped to set the tone of what people would expect from survival horror. When it seemed that those ideas became stale for some players in the early 2000s, he shifted things and again helped to set the tone of the genre. The Evil Within is definitely true to what Mikami believes are the core tenets of survival horror. It's also very obvious that the game's over-the-shoulder camera is taken directly from Resident Evil 4. There's something really appealing to me about using the format of the game that started the action trend in survival horror to create a game that aims to get back to the roots of the genre as a direct response to that trend. I first played The Evil Within at some point in 2017, so at the time it had been around 10 years since my last encounter with Resident Evil 4. I understood immediately that the game was making nods to the Resident Evil series, from the Beacon Hospital logo that looks just like the Umbrella Corporation logo, to stuff like this. But at the time, I didn't really give that notion much more thought. However, over on the Hidden Machine Twitch channel, we recently streamed both Resident Evil 4 and The Evil Within, jumping back and forth between the two games. During those streams, I was constantly noticing things from The Evil Within that felt like new iterations of ideas that Mikami first explored in RE4. I've noticed the sentiment online that Evil Within is a sort of spiritual successor to Resident Evil 4. Usually a game is a spiritual successor when a team wants to make a sequel, but doesn't have the rights to the original property. Although it's never been officially acknowledged, I think the argument could be made for The Evil Within being a sort of spiritual sequel to RE4, but it shares so many elements with RE4 that it almost feels more like a remake. A lot of the ideas that made it into Resident Evil 4 were met with resistance by members of the development team who felt that things were straying too far from the standards set in previous games. Mikami got rid of the Umbrella Corporation and drastically changed the look and gameplay of the series. Now, I'm just speculating, but it's fun to think about The Evil Within, which Mikami has stated would be his final game as a director, being a reimagining of one of his most successful works. Picture some sort of purist overlords of the survival horror genre accepting the evil within as some sort of act of redemption from Mikami after his work on RE4 led the genre's flagship series astray. In this made-up scenario, Mikami is taking back the game that arguably caused the demise of the golden era of survival horror, so that he can shape it into a title that restores the genre. Again, I can really only speculate about this, but I like to imagine a situation where some of Mikami's ideas that were turned down for RE4 reappear a decade later in The Evil Within. Capcom's influence may have hampered Mikami's creative vision on RE4, and Evil Within was developed at Mikami's own studio, conceivably giving him fewer restrictions. Now, Mikami was the general manager of Capcom Production Studio 4, and that's the studio that developed Resident Evil 4. So it's not like he didn't have a lot of influence at the time, but I think it stands to reason that he would have quantifiably more influence at Tango Gameworks, the studio that he actually founded. Regardless, even though the plots of the two games differ, and my whole theory about The Evil Within being a Resident Evil 4 remake might be bullshit, the similarities between the two games are undeniable. They both move at a very different pace, but essentially start the same way. Our protagonists, Sebastian Castellanos and Leon Kennedy, are riding along in police vehicles.
Maybe it's the ghost of that doctor who went schizo and chopped up all those patients.
That's not what happened. Some patients disappeared. Some kind of scandal?
Still, gives you the creeps, doesn't it?
127, 124.
We got together at some Boy Scout bonfire. Then again, maybe you did.
Oh, you crazy American. It's a direct order from the chief himself.
They pull up to a building and walk in to find themselves in a horrifying situation.
Smells like blood.
All right, stay sharp.
I was wondering if you might recognize a girl in this photograph.
¿Qué carajo estás haciendo aquí? ¡Lárgate, cabrón!
Sorry to have bothered you.
Freeze! I said freeze!
Soon after, they are knocked unconscious by an enemy. When they wake up, they are bound, and it appears as if the enemy plans to execute them. Resident Evil 4 uses this scene to introduce Louis Serra, and to give a little more exposition. Leon is on a mission to rescue the president's daughter, and Louis is a mysterious figure who appears to be a possible ally. The Evil Within decides to forego all the exposition and just throws you into a brutal nightmare. Both of our heroes are able to escape their captors, but tonally, the scenes feel very different. It's the same idea, but RE4 is setting things up like an action movie, and The Evil Within forces the player into the unknown, and from its very first enemy encounter, it really hammers in the idea of survival horror.
Yay. Crawl out of one hole and into another.
You want to tell me what's going on here?
I overheard one of the villagers talking something about the president's daughter in the church.
Even after freeing yourself as Sebastian, you don't feel any safer. Leon relies on his wits and quick reflexes to gain the upper hand in his situation, but it's going to be a long while in The Evil Within before the player feels like they have a tangible advantage over the enemy. Moving forward, the player finds himself in a village, crawling with villagers who have been taken over and transformed by some strange evil. In each game, the village area is accented by a large fire, and again, the survival horror aspect of The Evil Within is on full display, as the player is prompted to take a stealth approach to these early encounters. Ammunition is very low, and there is ample cover to aid the player in remaining unseen before going in for a stealth kill. Resident Evil 4 doesn't have any stealth kills. Both games give the player a combat knife, but the RE4 knife is used to break open containers and slash enemies. while the Evil Within's knife is used to silently dome unsuspecting baddies. From there, the similarities continue, and in every scenario from the Evil Within that feels inspired by RE4, the overall horror factor and vulnerability of the player is really amplified. Take your first encounter with these chainsaw-wielding enemies. In RE4, you can actually snipe this guy from pretty far back and never put yourself in direct harm. But in the Evil Within, you spend a good amount of time just hearing the grunts of this enemy before ever actually encountering him. And once you do, he immediately starts a very intense chase sequence. I have to admit, the first time I encountered the chainsaw guy in RE4, and his name is Dr. Salvador, it was scary. It's a really intense encounter, especially when you're first learning his attack patterns. However, the slow build toward the encounter with the chainsaw guy in the Evil Within makes the whole thing much more extreme and much scarier. Now, I don't want to suggest that the Evil Within is a better game than RE4. Even though I'm comparing them, I don't think it's fair to really compare them like that. Not only do they come from different console generations, they both aim to do very different things. The only point I'm really trying to make here is that these are two awesome games, and I think that the direct influence RE4 has on the Evil Within is really fun to explore. As these games progress, they both take the player into bizarre and seemingly impossible spaces. And as the Evil Within progresses, we see more and more scenes, enemies, and environments that draw direct influence from Resident Evil 4. In no particular order, here's a bunch of them. A scene where your companion starts coughing and you ask if they are alright, and they get mad and push you away, and then you're suddenly separated from them.
You're not listening. I'm not worried about stopping it, Seb.
Ashley! What's going on? Don't worry, Ashley. I'm coming for you.
These enemies, who hide behind these sliding panels and fire heavy artillery at you. This guy, who's initially caged up, but breaks free as you approach him, and then he attacks you with his giant Wolverine-style claws. There are these two mini-boss-like enemies that are nearly indestructible. One has a weakness to fire, and the other has a weakness to ice. And you escape your encounters with them by running down a tight hallway and entering an elevator.
What is it with you?
There's this garden maze area.
Sebastian, that's thinking about the church. Keep going. We're covering it.
This giant who is let out of his holding area and then crushes the enemies who let him out. All these bear traps. Using binoculars to scope out some villagers. This cupboard. I'm kind of kidding about that one. I had a hard time finding great shots of this, but in both games, many downed enemies melt into a puddle of bubbling goop. The main difference here is that in the Evil Within, you can collect this goop and use it to level up your stats and weapons. There's a scene where the protagonist begins to realize he's been infected and has a little freak out. A scene where you get knocked down and then are forced to fight enemies while trapped inside of a burning barn. A scene where you and your partner are holed up inside of a building and fighting off a wave of enemies that are breaking through the windows. This one is a bit of a stretch, but we have two sequences where you fire at enemies from the back of a moving vehicle. In Resident Evil 4, you'll often find a group of crows sitting at the entrance of a new area. This same thing occurs several times throughout The Evil Within. Oh, and while we're here, there's also this. It has nothing to do with RE4, but the place is clearly inspired by the Spencer Mansion from the very first Resident Evil game.
Hey! Stop, damn it!
Now what?
Getting back to RE4, both games feature a boss fight where an antagonist is sort of shielded by a large monster. You eventually expose them and they both die in a very similar fashion. And if all of that wasn't enough to convince you, there's also barrels. Now, I'm familiar with stuff like those videos that try to compare Kimba the White Lion to Disney's The Lion King. They take a bunch of clips from the different Kimba series, remove them from any context, and then try to say that The Lion King ripped them off. If you fell for that hoax, I gotta recommend the Your Movie Sucks deconstruction of those videos. To me, this is a very different situation because it's two singular works, both directed by the same person. The stories in both games are definitely unique from one another, but it's clear to me that Mikami and his team cherry-picked some of their favorite parts from RE4 and recontextualized them in a game that they felt would be more true to the original intentions of the survivor horror genre. And to me, that's really cool. And although he could never officially confirm this, he doesn't totally deny it either.
やってる僕個人としてはパロディ調にやってるつもりなんですけど、まあ今回そのプレゼンでやるときは結構そこがたくさん入ってるところで、むちゃくちゃたくさんあるわけじゃないですね。某ゲームをちょっとねパロってるところもありますね。言えないですけど。カプコンさんごめんなさい。
Now, if we think about The Evil Within as a remake of RE4, it's obviously a more drastic approach than the one taken in the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes. But what did those remakes aim to do? They updated the graphics and controls, took some of the most relevant story beats and reimagined or recontextualized them, and remade the game in a way that they felt would be more appealing to modern players. While The Evil Within does do a lot with its story and characters to define its own narrative and world, it shares so much DNA with RE4 that I think it really qualifies at least as a loving tribute to the game, if not an unofficial remake of Resident Evil 4. While doing my research for this video, I found out that The Evil Within was originally supposed to take place in some unnamed part of rural Spain, just like in Resident Evil 4. I believe that all of the characters with last names like Jimenez or Gutierrez are holdovers from that idea. So it stands to reason that the games could have been even more similar to one another if the setting of The Evil Within wasn't changed to the generic Crimson City. Either way, both titles are about an officer taking on an assignment and then finding themselves thrown into a bizarre world that they struggle to understand while fighting to survive. So to answer the question that this video asked, obviously, no, The Evil Within is not an official remake of RE4, but I think it's fun to imagine it as such. And it's fun to look at all the different ways that Shinji Mikami and Tango Gameworks reinterpreted the enemies, environments, gameplay mechanics, and narrative elements of RE4 to create a much scarier game. And that statement is not intended to take away anything from RE4. I think both of these games are amazing single-player experiences that any video game fan would benefit from playing. And that's about all from me today. I'm curious to know, what do you think of my theory here? Do you think that The Evil Within might inform anything about the upcoming Resident Evil 4 remake from Capcom? If you liked this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, and if you want to hear me and the other people at Hidden Machine talk about video games, then subscribe to our channel. We post new videos all week, and we also stream regularly over on our Twitch channel. I didn't know where to stick this in the video, so I'll just mention it here at the end. While we were streaming The Evil Within, we'd often joke that the nurse looked a lot like Bayonetta. While I don't know if this was intentional in any way, it's interesting to note that the woman who designed the nurse, Ikumi Nakamura, also worked on Bayonetta, and Bayonetta is a spiritual successor to Devil May Cry, and Devil May Cry actually started out as Resident Evil 4. At some point in development, it was decided that this game was too different from Resident Evil, so they made it its own series, Devil May Cry, and I just think it's interesting how all that stuff is linked, you know? It's cool. There's also a bunch of other references to games like Fallout or Silent Hill and different horror movies throughout The Evil Within, but I'm not going to get into all those. That's a video for someone else to make. See ya.